Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have had the great joy of meeting, getting to know, and learn from Matthew Stanley over this last year. Mr. Stanley is extremely perceptive. He's an extremely good writer, and he's talking about things that really matter. And I really am grateful for the chance to have this discussion with him today. And Mr. Stanley, if you would tell everyone what you work on, what's your book coming out, because I'm really excited for it, because I think it's an amazing novel that has not been elucidated nearly enough, and also where people can find your blogs and your writings, which I'm always impressed with how elegant, really focused they are and how much they bring out to think about.
You always shower me with compliments and I don't know how to respond, so thank you. Um, I've really been doing a lot of work lately on trying to cut to the core of what actually is my project because I found myself really scattered, just like writing about just random, interesting little tidbits. And I was finding that that was not, I think that was motivated by a desire to kind of like do party tricks instead of actually work on something substantive, like over a long period of time, pushing in a single direction. So I started by identifying kind of the threads of my thinking. I got like a seven. I got like seven core threads, and I was like, okay, how can I keep factoring these down? And I've kind of I've come to the conclusion that kind of the core of what I'm working on is finding the freedom and finitude. So freedom and finitude, those two concepts, that's kind of the core, bringing it together. Um, I come out of I come out of a Christian background. I'm a Christian myself, and one of the tendencies of Christianity is to define finitude as a problem. It's to define it negatively over and against, like to assume a notion of infinity, to assume a notion of the unbounded, and then to work backwards to the finite life of a creature. That's kind of why I call my work Samsara Diagnostics, because in Buddhism, that concept samsara is the word that we use for this realm of suffering, of pain, of death, and of dying, and of birth. So um, Christianity doesn't really have a comparable word for that. Like we can talk about creation, we can talk about nature, but they don't include that concept of suffering, death, and birth, and that sort of thing. So um, anyways, that's kind of what I've realized that I'm working on. And my book that I'm writing is connected to this because it's connected in how do we think, like as finite creatures, how do we think universally within our particularity? And specifically, I'm looking at the book Silence by Endo Shusaku. If you haven't watched the movie, I highly recommend the movie by Martin Scorsese, but the book itself is also eminently worth reading. But I'm writing a book about this book, and I think that there's this theological political conflict going on in the book where the Japanese regime in the early 1600s is trying to stamp out Christianity in its country. And the part of the reason why I think is because Christianity introduces this revolutionary, emancipatory way of thinking that is potentially disastrous for their kind of proto-nationalist project of trying to unify the country. So and I think that kind of the character's final decision in the novel, the main character, Father Rodriguez, I think that his decision ultimately is an exchange where he gets to enjoy this private, pure, quietist faith in his heart while becoming an essentially inert and useful piece in the ideological edifice of the nationalist regime. So I'm trying to show how, like, what is that emancipatory strain in Christianity and that he betrays, and what is the idea, what is the subjective structure that he assumes that allows him to maintain this quiet faith while nonetheless becoming completely assimilated into the dominant power structure in his society.
Mm.
So that is kind of relevant to some of these Christian nationalist questions that I think are coming up, but I think it's also just broader to how do you form emancipatory subjects that don't immediately reassimilate themselves into the power structure, but instead can kind of become sand in the gears.
Mm. Well, that was marvelous. I think you put your finger on a lot of extremely important points that, well, I think the Christian political project is always very, very difficult to kind of think through. And a lot of people, one, if you have the wrong metaphysics, if you will, your political project is going to be very different from say, the correct metaphysics. So, for example, if finitude is what you're trying to escape, then what might be considered political emancipation will be very different than if infinite and finite are somehow related, maybe incarnationally, if we want to use that language. So maybe in a theological conception where one is trying to escape finitude, or they have this kind of idea that that's what Christianity is about, but I would argue it is not, just like you're saying, then maybe a quietude sort of structure where you just let yourself be absorbed in the political system is not so bad, right? Because at the end, it doesn't matter that much, does it? But if instead there's some sort of kingdom work, and I guess there's, you could think of people like Niebuhr, Reinhold, read his brother, all these political sort of thinkers on what did this mean? Well, if in fact there is something about the political project that is trying to find the infinite in the finite, and that the finite and the infinite are somehow tied together, well, then a quietude that is not addressing the immediate situation that we're in would somehow be missing part of the Christian mission. And so right there, you have a direct kind of connection between one's metaphysical schema and how they would think through a very particular situation. And I think that tension as well between quietude and there's a kind of overactivity, right? There's a kind of overly engaged in politics, but then there's also a certain sort of rationalization of the political ideology that is problematic. And I sometimes wonder if part of the problem, like you're describing with the end of silence, is you are rationalizing your theology in light of the political paradigm instead of thinking your politics into your theological paradigm. You're getting the order backwards. And in so doing, what you do is end up supporting a particular political order that you may not even realize you're supporting, or maybe shouldn't support, or maybe you are suggesting that the particular human principalities are in control now, and that you're just supposed to accept that. Which then, if you do that, you're actually making a political statement that you're in favor or that you should do that. But it's interesting to think how all of those are connected. And then the last thing I'll say is it makes me think, because I have to get at least one Hegel reference in every conversation, is the difference between the spurious infinity and the true infinity in Hegel. A spurious infinity is a list, basically, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And a lot of people think that that's actually infinity, right? That you kind of counting up to an infinite number. Hegel's like, no, it's not. It's a pure abstraction, because even if the universe is super, super enormous, it doesn't contain an infinite list. True infinity is the relations between geometrical situation in Leibniz, really, where if you have a circle and you draw, it's finite, it's a circle, but if you draw one point here from one point over there, then here, 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 and you have all of these different ways that the finite relates to itself, then that's where you're approaching a true infinity, because critically, even if you go back and forth across the same line over and over again, every time you go back and forth, you change in your quality. So even a repetition of the same direction is actually not a repetition. There's an infinity that's part of that. And I think, really, if we think of the Trinity as three persons relating to one another like points in a circle, that's a true infinity. And then if we think kind of incarnationally, well, how God is remaking the world, it's relational. Well, relational would be kind of a true infinity. And so then the question becomes not how we escape the political, but how we relate to the political, and how we make, say, Christianity relate to the political order, not just kind of quietly accept it. But it is very interesting because there is that tension between that sort of Christian nationalism and then kind of passivity, where you're trying to decide, you're to say, oh, we should make the nation Christian, or no, we shouldn't be involved at all. And it's a very large question, but I guess the other thing too with it that would speak to your recent two pieces on like knowledge is toxic, it kind of makes me think a little bit of that. And I'll let you speak about those pieces, because I would love for you to elaborate on, because I found it very interesting. There also seems to be a similar tension where we're either like, oh, don't get online at all, don't read any knowledge, all books except theological text is good, and then, oh, it doesn't matter, more knowledge is good. Getting more knowledge is always a good thing. Likewise, it could be like, oh, being politically involved is always good. And then you get maybe this hardcore nationalism that's bad. But then on the flip side, you get this kind of just quietly accepted, and that's bad. So likewise, I almost sometimes feel like that's how we are with knowledge, or Christians can be. The only thing, it's either the only thing you should learn is theology, or all knowledge is bad. And it's instead, it seems more skill-based. It seems more like a weighing-based. It seems more like a Holy Spirit discernment-based on working of those things. But those are some thoughts that come to mind. that you're more than free to respond to. And then as well, I'd love you to talk about this idea of knowledge as potentially toxic, because I think that's a really important angle to take.
Yeah, one of the things that we can tend to do as human beings, and I think it's just kind of naturally ingrained, is that when we're getting new information, we're just actively assimilating it back into our paradigm. And so one of the struggles that you have with working with other people and trying to help them is that fundamentally the addition of new information is not something that can change a human being. Now, like a radical inbreaking of some sort of disconfirming piece of information might have the chance to kind of like break things up enough to just kind of unstable somebody. But when they're in that unstable mode, it's not that they're lacking information. It's that they're lacking the ability to envision a paradigm that's going to make sense of everything that they've encountered at this point. So like the basic problem with getting more information is that as you just get more information, it's just confirming your hypothesis. And so and that's Taleb's point in his book The Black Swan, where he talks about the turkey. The turkey wakes up every morning and has food, and it thinks, well, tomorrow I'm going to wake up and get food as well, but tomorrow's Thanksgiving Day. And so like when you put yourself at risk by just continually acquiring information, there needs to be another counterpart activity, which is being able to develop some distance from your data set and actually work on your paradigm. And that's, how do you do that? That's the really big question. How do you work on your own vision and your own way of being in the world? Because that's the thing that you're going to be organizing all of the incoming data through. Ultimately, the data can't give you the interpretive paradigm. You have to have that working paradigm as you're bringing in the data. And the problem is that you as a human being are going to naturally just be confirming that paradigm. So.
Oh no, I mean, it's that I think it might have been called Newman, where he said something like books don't tell you what they mean. Likewise, facts don't tell you what worldview they go in. Phenomenon, like they don't tell you which phenomenon are facts. If something is a fact, it's a phenomenon that has been changed into a fact because of the paradigm you carry by which it would be a fact. But that's a problem, because then a fact is already situated in a certain structure, right? Maybe that structure is true, maybe it's false, but that's already kind of at play there. And it's almost like, that being the case, it would seem like there's a radical difference between knowledge that is aware that it is a danger and knowledge that treats itself as if it's always good. Like a lot of times knowledge kind of presents itself as, oh, it's good to know this. But then it's almost like there's a knowledge here that's being described that also needs to bring with it an awareness that it is situated, or that it might be misallocating mental resources, or it may be creating confirmation bias. And the first question I would it's almost like the difference. Pei said this once, if I'm thinking philosophy, because all of this brings to mind the danger of philosophy that almost thinks that because it's philosophy, it can't make that mistake. Oh, we're philosophy, we're really insightful and critical. And then it's Thanksgiving Day, right? We've actually fed to the eating of the food, and then we have a problem. It's almost like the difference, like Pei Vio at Attention mentioned, between talking about philosophy and talking philosophy. That's the first thing I might be interested to explore. Where talking about philosophy is where you're talking about Kant, or you're talking about Hegel or whoever. Whereas talking philosophy is where you're literally thinking like a philosopher, like someone. And that seems to have a bit of the meta dimension. And maybe there's also a difference between thinking knowledge and thinking about knowledge. Maybe thinking knowledge is wisdom, where you're actually like thinking about all of the paradigms data brings with it that then you don't realize you're accepting, and you're like, well, do I want to accept this? Like, for example, if you're the turkey, you're aware that if I'm eating food every day, wait a minute, I'm assuming that every day I'm going to get food just because I've gotten food every other day. Maybe that's not a safe assumption. Whereas just someone who would be like, just kind of thinking knowledge about knowledge, would be like, oh, food, oh, food, oh, food, oh, food. Reason to think that you're going to keep getting food, as opposed to perhaps the framework that you're starting to assume because you're receiving food every single day. So I wonder if like thinking philosophy or thinking about philosophy, thinking knowledge, thinking about knowledge might be something, because of course the point there is the danger is you receive knowledge and therefore assume that that knowledge is correct, that you derive from it, and then you're the turkey being eaten on Thanksgiving Day because you're not ready for the black swan. So it's interesting to think about knowledge setting you up for that.
Well, let's compare the idea of knowledge to two other related notions, the notion of understanding and the notion of truth. Because I think if we compare knowledge to understanding to truth, what we realize is that most of the time we're actually dealing with understanding. And maybe there's a question of whether we even have knowledge. So, for instance, like we describe knowledge as the turkey sort of over time inductively reasoning that it will receive food. But the reality is that inductive reasoning cannot be knowledge, because inductive reasoning by its very nature is always open to the possibility of a counterexample and is constrained by your own inability to examine every example. So for instance, like technically speaking, we cannot have knowledge, which is, certainty. Knowledge is certainty. We cannot have certainty off of inductive reasoning. I would say we probably can't have certainty off of abductive reasoning either. Now we can have certainty off of deductive reasoning, and we could potentially achieve that. Seems interesting to follow up. But it actually seems like most of what we do is actually falls under the category of understanding, which is basically operating with a working model of the world, which is not knowledge. It's important to keep that in mind. Like, that's not knowledge. And then, so like this desire to have knowledge, this desire to theorize about how we have knowledge, to me seems kind of wrong-headed. Rather, we should be understanding how we reach understandings, how understandings function, and how understandings change over time. And then there's the whole question of truth, which I think truth is different from knowledge, because I don't think we have knowledge of truth. I think truth is something that is different from these other two as well. We could get into that, but I think I would actually want to carve out a truth as something different and more interesting and nuanced.
Well, that's really interesting distinctions, because, I like in the truism, the rational, I'll talk about coherence versus correspondence. So, for example, just because you have a lot of ideas that are coherent, and mostly humans are in the business of coherence, ergo understanding, because I require coherence or I cannot function. Like if the world is not coherent, I cannot function. But the funny thing is that very mechanism of thought that creates coherence so that I function is precisely why I'm susceptible to black swans or conspiracies or ideological capture. Like basically, I was talking with the great, the wonderful, great Hunter Coates, who wrote a wonderful book on conspiracy and Lacan. I highly suggest. I think you'd enjoy it a lot. He's a really great guy. And we were talking, and one of the things that came up is the idea that coherence, which you require not to lose your mind, is precisely why you might lose your mind. Like to think is to be playing with fire. And I think honestly, the high majority of philosophical epistemology has not taken this tragedy trade-off of competing goods seriously. So it's been wrong-headed. And arguably, it's been philosophy that has contributed to the problem of coherence, not helped us manage the problem of coherence or live with the problem of coherence. Because even if theoretically you can't be certain of what corresponds, the very knowledge that you can't be certain of correspondence can actually go a long way to at least having you hold things a little lighter so that you're not so susceptible to get carried away. So it's funny to think that coherence or understanding, which we need to not go crazy, is also why we might end up going crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we don't take seriously enough that I think reason should be classified as a form of mental illness. Like the need to reduce everything to rational certainty is psychotic. Like that is the world of psychosis, where everything is complete, where the system is all in itself, where we can attain to this complete unshakable certainty is the realm of madness. And I think that we have to be able to, like you said, we have to manage that, because there's this tool. Reason is this tool that sort of mimetically propagates itself through the human species, and that we have taken to it as a tool that's extremely useful, and it's taken us quite far. But at the same time, it's also, you need to realize that it's a parasite that can kill us if we give it too much space. I mean, this is why, like, if we, like, AI is kind of this pure rationality, and if we let AI sort of run rampant, it's like giving that parasite that psych. It's like letting the psychotic be the leader of and to lead us along the path. So I just don't think that we take this seriously enough.
No, I don't think so at all. I think everything you said was marvelous. I think it is psychotic. You know, I was saying basically the conspiracy is rationality's masterpiece. It's pure coherence relating to itself, finding its own justification that is not, that doesn't have to correspond. Now, I'm not saying there's no such thing as a true conspiracy. I'm saying the structure of a conspiracy. But that's part of the problem, right? Like, the very fact that there could be a true conspiracy is a necessary possibility for the masterpiece of rationality to be its own kind of self-turning wheel, if you will, in a Nietzschean sense. So we do not think about rationality as psychotic. When autonomous rationality is the term for that I'll use from David Hume, that is what causes the reign of terror. That is what causes the totalitarian of modernity. You know, Horkheimer or Donner, they'll talk about that. Rationality that causes the greatest violence, like the greatest violence in human history, basically requires a totalizing vision, and only rationality can give you that, because only rationality can freaking totalize, because reality doesn't totalize. And so if you find totalization, it must be rationally based. So total war, total vision, total anything is going to be coherence to itself, which then has a totalitarian threat to it.
Yeah, this is I mean, for Zizek and for Lacan, this is the realm of fantasy, where things are able to cohere. Like, what I love about, like, a dream is that in the moment, it feels like it all hangs together and makes sense, until you stop and think about it and realize, wait, there were all these details that totally didn't make sense. So what's interesting about images versus symbols and ideas is that images can give you that feeling that this is a complete whole, that it does make sense, but it only produces that impression because it's covering over some sort of incoherence to it. But it creates the impression of wholeness, and that impression of wholeness is something that we just latch onto. And then when we experience that wholeness, we just get caught in this crazy loop. Like, I love G.K. Chesterton. He talks about how it's that the poet is the one trying to get his head into the clouds, and it's the madman who tries to get the clouds into his head. That's what it is. The point is that, like, the poet is this one who, like, realizes that they can't get the clouds into their head, and that they realize that there's so much to discover by getting their head up into this non-totalizing all. Whereas the insane person is the person who thinks that they can figure it all out.
I think bringing in Mr. Chesterton is magnificent. I think that idea of the poet tries to get their head in the clouds while the madman tries to get the clouds in their head is just another example of how we could succinctly tear down 200 years of philosophy just like that. You know, he's just such a genius. And he also has that part where he says the madman is the one who tries to get contradiction and paradox out of their thinking, whereas the true intellectual maintains paradox and contradiction in their thinking, because the moment you understand, and you could get into Kowabaski or all the symbiotics, different little people, the moment you understand that the word bookcase is not the same as a bookcase, well, then that would mean the entire structure of intelligibility is dealing with a kind of error that is necessary for coherence. Well, if there's a kind of error necessary for coherence, then the moment you start thinking about your view of the world as free of error, you have lost sight of the foundation of its possibility, and it's probably now auto-cannibalistic. It's probably going to eat itself because it has to deny that it is founded by an error, because it does not allow error into its thinking. So it has to eat itself eventually, because it has to hide the revelation of that error, which will inevitably poke through here and there. We'll have to deny that, and we'll just snake eating it. You know, Chesterton also speaks about the man as the snake eating its own tail, of course, you know, kind of eating his own tail. So I think that's all spot on.
Well, and speaking of conspiracy, I mean, The Man Who Was Thursday, with a conspiracy where it turns out that all of the people in the conspiracy were double agents for the other side. Like, I love, like, Zizek always brings up Chesterton, and I love it when he does, because it's just like weird clash of worlds. But it's this idea that the person at the core of the conspiracy was even themselves not fully in the conspiracy, and they're not who you thought that they were. And so the lack is also in the big other. And I think that when we lose that, we should make fun of people who want to reduce everything to reason. We should mock them, because they want a world that's boring. They want a world that without creativity. They want a world that nobody wants to live in. Like, without mobilizing contradiction and paradox in your thought, you never reach a crossroads. There's no point when you hit that moment of contradiction, you now open up a spectrum of potential ways of moving forward. But if you didn't have that moment of contradiction, you would just have a machine clicking over and over and over again in the exact same repetition. You'd be stuck. And so, like, I don't want to live in that world. I have no interest in that. And I think most people, if you were really to ask them, they would agree. But as linguistic beings, I don't think that we have to live in that world, because we have symbols. We think in symbols, and because symbols don't have this, they don't have a necessary relationship with what they symbolize. There's always this constant slippage and ambiguity where, because the symbol does not correspond to a symbolized one-to-one directly, in that gap, in that interplay between two things that are not identical and yet are, that's where you get the openness and the play of thought.
Excellent comment. As a note, I think a wonderful project would be to compare the Thursday novel with Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco, and actually Kafka's The Trial, because all of those are going to exploring ways that rationality is unable to escape its own structure, and how in its very inability, it creates the problem that it's trying to solve. In the same way that Joseph K., the way that he escapes the trial is to go deeper into the trial. Like, he creates the very situations that he's then on trial for. And that's because he's responding rationally to the situation. Someone shows up in your room, says that you've broken a crime, you go to the court, you try to solve it, but that's actually just going deeper and deeper into it. And Foucault's Pendulum is also quite, and then Thomas Pynchon, The Crying Lot of 49. All of those works are great testaments and warnings to the problem of rationality, autonomous rationality, rationality that tries to be its own grounding. The other thing that I was going to say, that I think it's very important to take dreams seriously as a kind of revelation of what rationality is. We tend to say, oh, that was a dream, this is rational. But you see, the only difference between a dream and rationality is a dream is thought relating to thought, basically. And when you're a human, thought has to encounter a phenomenon or determinations, right? So the world restricts thought by its very determinations. But when you dream, thought is not restricted by the world. It's just restricted by the stimuli. But you see how thought is infinitely capable to arrange the stimuli however the heck it wants and make it believable. So believable, in fact, that you assent to it without even realizing it, unless you do the lucid dream thing. But then in the lucid dream thing, what does it give you the impression? I have power here, right? So here's actually a danger. When philosophy teaches you that rationality isn't its own grounding, there's two responses. One, oh, that means I can make the world fit my rationality, which is the dangerous, that's what Hume kind of talks about, like the philosopher that kind of rises up once they realize rationality is not bound by the world. And they're like, well, then the world has to fit into my thinking. Whereas for Hume, the name of the game is to actually make rationality subservient and humble to common life, because the world is far greater than rationality, versus the flip temptation, which you can get erroneously in an oppression from lucid dreaming, as it will, which is you can make the world fit your thinking. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with lucid dreaming, but one of the things we kind of other dreaming, we kind of say, oh, that's just a dream, as if that's not what we're doing all the time, when dreaming is a kind of revelation of that thought is just simply its own coherence.
My book that I am like over a long period of time working on, kind of my theory of epistemology, I'm calling it Dreaming Wide Awake. That's that, like, you got to it. Like, this concept of lucid dreaming, I think, is like kind of what we're always doing. And I think we can look at these liminal moments where things seem very real but are not. So I mean, think about, for instance, like the phantom limb. Like, people, like, if you think that, you know, oh, the world is just so real that there's no way that I could ever sort of enter into a world that is so utterly not the real world, except for the fact that your brain can literally produce the experience of a limb that's not there. And in fact, you can't even make it go away without proper therapies. And even these therapies, what they have to do is use a mirror to project the existence of that limb in order for the therapist to work with it, to resolve this non-existent symptom. So, like, to me, it's like, if that's a description of your brain lucid dreaming. And I think that what a lot of this gets back to is just that there's so much more to the brain than conscious experience. And that's really scary to people. Like, that's really scary for us to think about. I know that, like, I've been reading Sartre, trying to kind of put him in conversation with Freud. And the thing that Sartre just keeps putting his foot down, the reason why he really, really doesn't like Freud's philosophy, is because Freud posits things that we experience as givens, which condition the freedom of the subject. But Sartre says, I do not posit anything before the freedom of the subject. In fact, he even says that environmental factors do not condition the subject, because they still have to be converted by the subject into a state of affairs. So, like, but like, to me, like, if you study epigenetics, things like that, like, you begin to realize that this simply is not true. That the subject, if we're talking about the subject in language, like a nothingness, like a void that gets produced and inserted into reality, kind of becomes this point of pivoting. I might be more on Sartre's train, but I don't think that's the only form of subjectivity. So, like, and that's the problem. So he's just positing that one form of subjectivity.
Well, a few things. One, you just put your finger, again on one. I can't wait for that book, because that book is so desperately needed. Out freaking standing. One of the things too that ends up happening is rationality kind of scapegoats dreams, because rationality says, "Oh, that's just a dream," and then I'm therefore rational. It deifies itself in saying that I'm not like the dream, and you can trust me. And then, funny enough, in a kind of Girardian sense, although I do side with Lacan, I like Girard, it kind of in like, oh, that's just a dream. Then the dream becomes a god as well, actually, because like, oh, dreams are so wonderful and dreams are all these kind of things and look all the things that we can do. So there's this weird way in which rationality kind of others itself from the dream, precisely because it's so similar to the dream. And then in doing that, it kills it as just a dream. But then it actually raises it up to wonderful as rationality, as autonomous rationality is unleashed upon the modern world. So there's a really weird kind of Girardian thing going on between rationality and dream. When the thing is that makes rationality so difficult is in the same way.
It's a mimetic rivalry. You're basically saying that
yes,
reason sets up a mimetic rivalry with dreams.
Yes, that's correct. Okay. Yeah, I think it does, because also too, rationality, like in a dream, you just kind of get what you want. And rationality is like, no, that's just a dream. I can get what I want too. So there's kind of a mimetic, like dreams make you happy. Oh, I can make the world I want. Rationality is like, well, I can do that too, because it is a dream, because you are actually a dream, and there's a mimetic rivalry that forms. And then there's a scapegoating of dreaming as other from rationality, when really they are much, much, much more similar than people realize. But by thinking they're different, then we don't have, well, basically what you like. So basically what ends up happening, if they're other, we just don't investigate the depths of subjectivity. Like you were pointing that out with Sartre, right? Like if dreaming and rationality are two sides of a very similar coin that I'll just often call like thinking there versus thinking here, coherence versus correspondence, well then subjectivity might have something that's more, and I won't open this can of worms, but basically in Hegel with, that's two, I got two criteria, with the absolute idealism, which is this weird thing that we can't control our determinations, like you're just born in English, you don't choose that, but you as a subject then learn the English and can choose to identify it and turn it from a determination into a necessity for your freedom. It's the condition of your freedom. And therefore, the determination ceases to be something that determines you, but something that you embrace in your subjectivity as a necessity, in the same way that a painting needs a canvas to be painted on. And yet the painting is not really limited by the canvas, because without the canvas, a painting can't exist. There's a sense in which it's limited, but really the limit is what defines it as itself. And so that is, how do we as subjects come to actually view Hegelian determinations as the necessities for the expression of our freedom? Because without those determinations, we would not have things to be free with, not just in. Like there's a kind of changing to withness. And so then the question, I'll give it back to you, is we have to think about rationality not merely as being rational about the bookcase, but rational with the bookcase somehow. Like we see, I'm creating a coherence that may not get at the bookcase entirely, but it's going to be with it in a manner that is corresponding with the bookcase as I am living in a world that is constituting what the bookcase is, how it relates to me, what its role is. And then there's a way in which a dream is a revelation of that. Because do you really get correspondence in a dream? Do you correspond with dream phenomenon? Or is it, and yet there's a way in which you do, because when you're in a dream, you think about, oh my gosh, I'm late for class, I got to get to class. And if you get to class and you're late, you really feel it, right? There is a kind of thought that's trying to correspond with the dreamscape as landscape, dreamscape. And yet that correspondence is inseparable with the coherence that the dream is trying to make as it is thinking and as it is operating. So the line between coherence and correspondence gets collapsed in a dream, and then rationality kind of tricks us in making us feel like the distinction is very hard in the real world, and that rationality is just in the business of corresponding with reality. So you should join QAnon today, or you should join the conspiracy, because that's where you're going to correspond, right? So I think the scapegoating, and then the last thing is, the problem is where in Heidegger, if a doorknob is broke, you notice it. Rationality never breaks itself, just like a dream doesn't break itself. It just carries itself unless you do the training to know better. Well, likewise, philosophy, like rationality can never be to itself a broken doorknob, because it has no determination. So it can always find a way to seem like it's working. And so you never see what it is. You never look at it. So we almost have to intentionally break rationality with rationality in order to kind of know that, to look at it and just see, oh my gosh, it's in the business of coherence more than correspondence. So like you have to intentionally break it, whereas the world will luckily break itself for you. And then you notice things like thought does not so much.
So what you're saying is making me kind of question this distinction that I've been playing with lately, because I've been reading a lot about Derrida and Wittgenstein with this group that I'm a part of. And I've been playing with this distinction between symbols mean, so signs mean, people think. So for instance, what is going on in Derrida and Wittgenstein's critique of language is that they're trying to say that thoughts are not what imparts meaning. So the mental action is not what imparts meaning to something. Meaning is actually just a function of the external movement of signs. And so you mean by employing signs, but the signs are actually doing the work of the meaning, which is interesting because meaning is both a noun and a verb. It's very interesting, but it's actually a mechanical external operation of the manipulation of signs. So, but then what are we doing? Well, it seems like we're thinking, but we're thinking with the material. Thinking is actually kind of like a working over of a material. And what you were talking about of like thinking with the bookcase makes me think about thought. There's also a sense in which thought is also happening externally, because the thought is actually happening in the working through of the material And the material is not all mental material. It's not all just objects in our brain, which actually I take that back. There are no objects in our brain. So like that's totally just an effect of consciousness. I'm kind of proving my own point a little bit. So like I'm curious to get your take on that. Like where does in that distinction between like signs mean people think, what's that difference between meaning and thinking? And is it too simplistic to say people think? Because is thinking actually also an external operation of a working through of material in the world? But then what is the cognitive process that is like a part of that? Because it's both, you know?
That's an excellent question. So there's a few things. So first off, there's the idea that thinking seems to naturally seek meaning. Like it is looking like it is very difficult. Like the moment I say, I don't understand what you just said, I understand that I don't understand what you just said, right? Like it's very difficult for me to think and it just be a pure thought. But there's also a funny thing in which like, here's, I guess, the question. Maybe we can frame it like this. When you dream, is a dream meaningful? Because or is it just kind of a world where it creates a kind of desire, or it creates maybe a sense of direction, but does it create a kind of meaning? There's one way in which it's almost like an ultra saturation of meaning, because everything is there for a reason, because you're sorting it through the day, or like everything kind of stands out to you that you focus on. But at the same time, there's also a way in there where there's a lot of background, but it's almost like anything at any moment can turn into a subject of thinking that then is meaningful to you. So I guess another thing too with that, I always think about the difference between thinking and perceiving. And for that is the difference between, if I go, oh, bookcase. So I'm thinking about a bookcase right now, and I've created a symbol, right? Bookcase that I've transferred to you, and that means something to you, right? Now, the question is the following. Are you now thinking about bookcase because I've transferred the symbol to you, or are you simply letting it kind of flow over you in a way, right? Like, are you there's a way in which when I kind of pass the symbol to you, there's a way in which you go, okay, but it's almost like when I'm thinking about the bookcase and I'm trying to sort it into a point that I'm making, there's a way in which the symbol is kind of trying to receive the thinking that I'm going to give to it so that you can kind of place it in a context. Because otherwise it just kind of sits there and it's not really clear where it's going to go. And the point is that like when I perceive the bookcase, like I turn off my thought and go, there's just a bookcase. But now I'm thinking about the bookcase. But there was some kind of mental act, which is really weird. Like when you meditate and you don't think at all, there's almost like something super meaningful about it. This is what I guess I get. Like there's actually a feeling of meaning that comes from a suspension of thought, right? But maybe that's just retrospect a minute later, where like when you see like a beautiful sunset, it suspends your thinking and you're like, and it kind of takes you. That is meaningful, or is it meaningful? So if I'm thinking live, like do you have to then think to have it be meaningful? And can you have it just kind of stay in that state where you don't think about it and it has a meaning to you, or do you have to add it? Because if we say you have to add the thinking, then I guess the question is it possible to receive a symbol that means and not think about it? Like, because if not, then meaning and like thinking are always kind of going together.
Well, I think this is Wittgenstein's point, is that the experience of meaning is sort of like Pavlov's dogs, where in the example you just gave me, you gave me a symbol, but I don't think that you imbued it with any sort of like, you imbued it with meaning or imbued it with your experience, like a substance, and then I was able to extract some of that. What happened was you gave me a symbol, and I am trained. I have ingrained within me the response that when I receive this symbol, this corresponding action takes place in my person. And so what happened, like you give me the symbol of bookcase, and just I don't even have to think about it, almost like as natural as breathing, bookcase, like all of my conception of a bookcase just springs to my mind. I didn't have to think about it. I didn't have to go into the encyclopedia and pull out bookcase. My brain just responded. And I think that Wittgenstein's point is that something can be meaningful, and you don't need to think about it. Precisely in the situation where, like, you know, like the example, like slab, you just grab the slab. You didn't even have to think about it. Like, you could, like, if a person just says slab, you just, like, almost like a reflex, you just grab it and give it to them. Like, the meaning is actually an effect or an outcome that gets produced through a medium. Whereas it seems to me like thinking is different than that.
Mm-hmm. No, so if we're looking at Hegel, what Hegel would say is you start with determinations that you have to think about to move into being things you don't have to think about, where you can just then in the future respond to them as meaning without thought, but they only get to be a meaning because of thought. So there's this moving of something you focus on in the foreground to being something that's in the background, but then the act of thinking and meaning are not the same, even if thinking is needed to create a meaning. And then there would be the question on, say, the difference between an instinctual response, like you just like instinctually reply to kind of food or being hungry like a baby. For example, you just know something's lacking, even if you're not sure what's lacking. Like there's a meaning of the lack. And then as you get older, you say, oh, what was lacking is someone changing my diaper. Oh, someone's changing. So what is changing diaper? Oh, mom gets cloth, goes bathroom. I can see it's occurring. I've thought. And then in the future, when you're a 2-year-old, there's no thinking. You just this process is going to happen. You don't have to think about the formation of this process. So it's interesting that there's a kind of, maybe it starts as like lack has meaning. Then you think about to transfer what that meaning is into a more symbolic structure. And then in the future, you don't have to think about it, which then has a cognitive offload to think about something else. So for Hegel, there's a movement from determination to necessity, which then makes space for new determinations, necessity, and you're always kind of processing it back to where you don't. So thinking is always thinking not to think, basically. Like thinking is in the businesses of getting out of thinking.
So, like, what I hear you describing is the process of learning. And because learning is that attempt to take a determination and convert it into a necessity, to take kind of an insight and be able to ingrain it into yourself to where it becomes just a part of flora and fauna of the mind. And so both there's learning, and then there's also like unlearning in order to relearn. So there's modification of the learning too. So there's two questions there. There's the moment of learning. Is that moment of learning different from when you have to break up a necessity in order to reform it with newly learned insight? Are those the same or new moments? I wonder. I could see arguments both ways. But this is why I think Wittgenstein focuses so much on making you look at moments of learning, where he tries to describe scenes where people are learning things, because he wants you to pay attention to how learning happens. And what he points out is that learning doesn't work the way that you think it works. Like we talk about language, like it's this naming game where, he opens Philosophical Investigations with this image of Augustine saying like, oh, I learned words by people pointing at stuff. And when they pointed at enough, eventually figure out what they meant. And Wittgenstein goes, no, you didn't, because let's talk about how you actually learn things. How do you point at red? How do you point at this? Because the problem with the pointing picture of learning is you can always say, what are you pointing at? No, what? Because I tweeted this the other day. I point at something and my son, who's 9 months old, looks at my finger. But he's not wrong. He's not wrong to look at my finger, because what am I pointing? Like even the act of pointing as though like this object is actually referring to another object, that cannot be supplied by the act of pointing. So the work of demonstration and learning is so much more fraught than we give it credit for. And I think that's the whole of what Wittgenstein is trying to get us to see in the investigations.
So everything you said is extremely important. So to clarify, for what Hegel is describing is meaning comes before thinking. And then you have a meaning like, oh, this red. Like there's a redness there that's a qualia. And the weird thing is the meaning, the moment the meaning is put into language, it is translated into thought that makes it seem like it was always just thought. And so for Hegel, it becomes really difficult to then break up, like you described, you learn and then you have to relearn and break it up into something else. That's sublation, where you're negating what you learned. So you had to basically make a mistake. There was no way to kind of learn other than to confuse thinking with meaning. And then you have to go, wait a minute, that was a kind of necessary mistake. So it's not irrational, but it is a kind of failure that then you have to negate to realize, no, wait, the quality came first. So in the science of logic, we'll talk about like quality and quantity. So for example, when you try to quantify something, you're actually always quantifying relative to a quality. So if I were to say one apple, one banana, one pear, what you're going to say, oh, 3 fruit. Well, why did you quantify those together? Because they all share the qualities of a fruit, right? So the quality actually comes before the quantification. And in fact, it's incredibly difficult to quantify if you don't see a pattern. If there's not some sort of meaningful similarity that then you are identifying and quantifying. And so like if I go 1 person, 2 persons, there's 2 people here. And even if I go bookshelf, notepad, coffee cup, my brain immediately goes to look for like a pattern on why I counted those things together, right? So it is not the case that once quality you could associate with meaning, quantification you could associate with thinking, although we tend to think that meaning is a product of thinking, but there is a kind of meaning that is found in thinking, because then I say, oh, these are 3 fruits, but then I have to realize that I can't reduce the quality I just went through to the fruits. There was actually an identification of a phenomenon that came before the act of thinking. And so what Hegel then wants to say is, what do we do when we realize that quantification changes quality? So if the quality of a human being that can measure reality in terms of, say, science is different from the quality of a human being that cannot, and by extension, they change the world that they're in. Like the identification, like the world will be a product of, say, your relation between thinking and meaning, right? So the way you think those relate will then change how you make society, how you act as a human being, which will then a feedback loop change you, which then could begin reinforcing one another and creating all sorts of different problems. But if instead you go, wait a minute, quantification only works after qualification, there has to be a meaning that we think about as opposed to think to create a meaning, well, then you can go, oh, what would it mean to think in a manner that is honoring meaning as opposed to replacing meaning? And that would be kind of the sublation where now thinking and meaning are related together. So they're apart as they must be for you to kind of understand them. But then you get to the place where you realize you can negate that separation, that passing over, move into the speculative reason where you actually see that meaning and thinking are different, and yet they always pass over into one another. And so then the question is, what does it mean that they passes over into one another? And how can we have a new quality of thinking aware of that passing over for one another? And that would be the move of kind of speculative reasoning. So I think they're distinct. I definitely think that meaning and thinking are distinct. But the interesting thing is once you know that they're distinct, then you kind of hold them together. And then how do you, knowing that they're distinct, then change how you operate? Do you get a new quality of thought that actually holds them together and changes the quality of thought once you know that they can go together? So there's this interesting way in which they're distinct, but they immediately pass over to one another. But then if you're aware of that, the way that they can pass over to one another can kind of change.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on that. My first question, I want to get my second one. I'm afraid the first one's going to derail us. But my first question is, why, like, you said that the meaning comes before the thinking, but it seems like being able to think certain things is also the precondition of certain objects even appearing.
Yes.
Like in terms of like colors, for instance, if you don't have a word for a color, you won't see it as a distinct color, or like if you don't even have, if you haven't been given the notion of like thisness, or think about languages that gender objects. English doesn't gender objects, but other languages do. Like if your language doesn't gender objects, you're not going to experience objects as gendered. Whereas if it does, you actually will begin to experience the world in slightly different ways. So I'm wondering, where does that fit into what you were saying? And the other thing that I wanted to think about was how the openness of meaning is contrasted with the closed system of thinking. And so it's almost like meaning is the possibility generation machine that thinking then picks up and kind of processes. And so it's like, because, for instance, we talked about the dream. The dream is not meaningful in itself, but the dream is an openness to multiple possibilities. There could be 10 interpretations of the dream. None of them's right, none of them's wrong, but they're all productive. And so what you could do is you have this space that gets opened up where multiple forking paths could come out, and thinking can't produce that. Rationality can't produce that space. But once that space is produced, rationality could pick up or follow one of those forking paths in the woods, so to speak, and work it through and refine it to a crispness and a clarity that it couldn't have had before.
No, I think that's an excellent question. So, the first thing would be the question of, if I'm not thinking and I'm just kind of perceiving, turning off my brain, the bookcase, a state of pure perception, is that meaningful? Kind of that all thing. Is that meaningful? Or is it only meaningful the moment I start to think about it, right? Like, is it meaning? And it's tricky to talk about a state where you're not thinking about something. But that's kind of like the question, because if we say, no, there's actually a kind of meaning in thoughtlessness, do I experience division between the bookcase, the wall, the pictures when I'm not thinking?
Yeah, so my question is, you're making the point, like, if you read Merleau-Ponty, you realize that there's already a paradigm of what you're looking at in your supposedly pure perception, because you think that the contrast between the wall and the bookcase is, you see that contrast because you've already brought this paradigm of them being distinct. But it may be the case that they are not distinct, and that there's maybe that's a shadow or something, and so I just even wonder about that possibility of even pure perception not already being suffused with meaning of a framework, some sort of working paradigm where you've attributed some sort of meaning and distinctness to particular objects.
Well,
is that meaning or rationality? There's a question there, I guess.
Well, so there's like two sides. So there's one, the question of, is it when you have the pure perception, is that meaningful? Then there's the question of thinking, and does thinking produce a meaning that is different or on the same gradient as the meaning before thought? So there's kind of like, you have some potential kind of meaning there, say in the framework, where, if I'm seeing bookcase, that means I'm human, right? Because I'm seeing a bookcase instead of, say, atoms, right? And that in of itself creates some sort of harmony of experience that might be meaningful to me. So there's these differences between like meaning and meaningful. Then when I think about it and I generate, that's grandma's bookcase, let's say, for example, is that meaning different in kind from the meaning before thought? Or is it on the same gradient per se? Like, is it a kind of meaning that's also similar or similar in kind to the meaning that came before the thought? Because that to me is an interesting question, because there's a few other things. Well, let me let you speak.
I was going to say, I bet that has to do with where it's settled into in your brain. Like I wonder if where the processing center of that experience is coming from. Like for instance, if it's of like a old precious memory, maybe it's settled into a different processing center in your brain, as opposed to kind of being like at your fingertips where you're still working with it. Maybe it's worked its way deeper down and it's kind of like become one of those necessities, for instance. And so I wonder if there's that, like, where things are being processed and where they're able to settle into might affect what that is. I'm just kind of
that's a great way to approach it, because it could be different between different people, right? Maybe for me, the thought, it's my brain, it could vary quite a lot. The other question would be, So, for example, the moment I say bookcase or I experience bookcase, and I think basically Ponti makes it very clear that you can never do any sort of thinking without phenomenology at the center of it. And I think Hegel would agree as well, because the moment you kind of experience bookcase, there's a framing that occurs there, right? And so you can't escape the subject. Like any idea of kind of an ontic realm that is independent of the subject doesn't exist. The great Hegel Kant debate is the following. When I'm stuck in the framing of the bookcase, is that bookcase, which is made of atoms, is the bookcase less real than the atoms, equally real with the atoms, or more real than the atoms? So when I have pure perception of the bookcase, is that real correspondent knowledge about what the phenomenon is, even though it's already framed by me as a human being? So if we say, well, no, because it's just your take on the bookcase, okay, well, then that's one thing. But Hegel would basically kind of say, no, the bookcase is indeed a framing of the subject from its atoms or its material or whatever, but you can't make the reductionist fallacy to say that the whole is less real than the parts, because the moment you use the term parts, like maybe they are parts in themselves because they're a part of a whole, right? So there's some sort. So then what ends up happening is, although human being, you're always kind of stuck in a certain framing, the framing, because that frame, X framing comes forth versus Y framing comes forth, the X framing has to have some correspondence with what the thing actually is, even if it's a glass darkly, even if it's kind of incomplete, even if it's not the entire thing. And then the question would be, like when you have the kind of pure perception where you're not thinking at all, it's almost like you have two ways to interpret that. One, oh, I'm having an experience of a partial meaning that's kind of suggested by this framing where I negate thought, which actually is a revelation that I should also negate the idea that my perception is whole and entire. Or you say, oh, I've gotten at the whole truth. It seems like both in perception and in thinking, there's a danger of thinking you have the whole. Like there's always got to be this kind of realization that even in a pure perception, there's a frame that's occurring. Likewise, when you think, there's a kind of framing that occurs. But then the other ditch is to say that whatever you experience has nothing to do at all with what is actually there. Whatever that means, of course, but that it has no sort of revelation of the essence. Because once you do that, you just fall into, oh, I'm in thought, and that's it. It's just kind of random. It is, in fact, all a dream, as opposed to what Hegel wants to suggest is, yes, thought is very dreamlike, but it is actually participating in the essence of things. It has something to do what is actually there. Now, it's not a magic trick where you can snap your fingers and change it, but the moment we frame that as a bookcase, we are in fact participating in what the thing is and helping it be a bookcase. Maybe violently, maybe in a problematic way, but maybe creatively, right? Maybe the difference between creation and violence is kind of thin, in the same way that dreaming and thinking seems to be very thin. But that seems to be part of it, that the differences here are all very, very thin. And so maybe the part of philosophical thought is learning how to maintain those thin differences.
I guess I'm just still not fully sold on why we need to think in the correspondence framework to begin with. Because the problem I see is that, you posited, like, is the bookcase more real or are the atoms more real? But the reality is that they're both conceptual.
Yes.
Like it's not that, like, quote unquote, what is there? Like, we can't actually articulate what is there, because even science, which sort of hubristically claims to be able to say what is there, when you get down to what they say is there, it's actually not a there. It's a bundle of statistical chaos. It's a conceptual framework, like the little atom that they give you to play with in 4th and 5th grade. That is not what an atom looks like.
Right.
Like, we don't know what an atom looks like. We can just describe it statistically, and we can't even say what it exactly is. We can only describe certain qualities and certain points and moments, and even those, like, it does things that we can't explain. So it's like, to me, the bookcase, saying, like, even if the bookcase is a conceptual unity that we've provided, the same is true for whatever the idea is of matter that we have that's supposedly more real. So to me, it's all on the same spectrum of consciousness's function of world producing. So I feel like the whole framework of there's thinking, there's things out there, they correspond with each other. I feel like we have to get past whatever, like we're enthralled to that picture. I feel like we need to get past that.
Well, let me exactly, because in Hegel, you go through the effort of realizing thought is in the business of coherence. It attempts to correspond, but then it realizes all it can do is correspond with itself, which then has the revelation that there are no things, only situations. And this would be like where Hegel in quantum is very much like Leibniz. And Leibniz is, and Mr. Anthony Morley has a tremendous book on this. Leibniz is extremely useful here. So Leibniz, and this also would suggest that when you were talking about the distinction between like humans think and that like symbols mean. So what Leibniz would say, yes, all intelligibility is a situation of thinking that is in a dance basically with meaning, and that they are always trading off with one another and seeking to understand one another. And you can never talk about one without also talking about the other, even if they are distinct. And this is the thing that Leibniz is going to say, is that basically all reality is in the image and likeness of the Trinity. Three persons, one essence. There are very meaningful distinctions, and yet the essence is a situation, is what Leibniz wants to say. So what Leibniz points out, he's critiquing algebra, calculus, and he says this is very dangerous because it implies that you can have thinking that's independent of situation. And he wants to say that the only mathematics should be geometry, because there are no points in the universe, only relations in geometrical situations. And if you start to think that there are things, as in points, as opposed to a situation that always involves a subject who is weaving the points into a geometrical situation, then he's like, you're going to get infinite fallacies of thought. Because you're going to end up actually enlisting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as opposed to an infinity within, say, the circle, the true infinity, which is that is a framing of relations. Like that's a geometrical situation. He even goes so far to say, he basically suggests that we shouldn't call it metaphysics, but metageometry. Because the moment you talk about metaphysics, you start talking as if the form is a thing that is a description of a thing, as opposed to a form being a formulation of a thing through time in concert with the subject. So the trick here, and there's a lot more to say with this, but the funny move that Hegel, and I think Hegel is completely all over Leibniz, what Hegel wants to say is because he's very Trinitarian. Hegel is extremely Trinitarian in his thinking. He thinks one of the big mistakes is thinking about God as a point, God, as opposed to a community, kind of like a Trinity. He's basically all of reality is communal. And so what ends up happening is that as each person of the Trinity is giving themselves over to the other, and they're giving themselves back, likewise, I'm giving myself to the bookcase, which is giving itself back, which then is meaningful. It's giving me a meaning that then I think about, that then changes its meaning, and we're all in community with one another. And I, as the subject, am weaving the situation of the room with the bookcase with me that has a meaning that then I think about, change its meaning, change the situation. So there are no things, only situations. And basically for Leibniz and Hegel, we've had years and years and years of trying to find the reality of things, and we haven't really, and that's created an epistemology of coherence and correspondence, when really we should have an epistemology of situation. And that's where, you go through thinking coherence to think correspondence. You do the dialectical move, then you negate sublate both of them into speculative reason, which is reasoning through situation. And that's where, for Hegel, Kant is a historic moment of framing the problem of correspondence that then you exhaust to realize the need for situation. So basically, all philosophy, if you will, then has to be a coordination of situation, not an either or. And so it's a coordination of relations where you maintain distinctions, because there are distinctions between the persons of the Trinity, and yet they share the same essence. And so then the question becomes, how do we do all thinking like that? So indeed, but then of course there is the question is, what is the nature of correspondence in the Trinity? It's clearly not the same as the correspondence of thought equals bookcase, but it's almost like an effort of correspondence that you know is going to fail, because you can never capture the whole of God, and yet you try because it's an act of love. But in that effort to understand, you're also open to the change. Like, what does it mean to try to correspond with a situation where you know that you can never capture the whole of the situation, but you're also trying? It's like this intentional failure, right? It's almost like, what is theology? Like theology, you're trying to actually frame God. You don't want to go into heresy, but you also know that you can't ever totally correspond with God. Otherwise, that's idolatry, right? So I think about like what is correspondence in theology is interesting to me as well.
And yet what I love about Bart is his optimism about, and his and yet we can know God, because this situation that you just described, if it were the case that this God who is the object, who's the potential object of being known, is if that God were to become a part of oneself and begin to know himself through you, then you have an avenue for truly knowing him. Yes. Because he's now a part of you.
Yes.
And so I think that it's like, this is the Calvinist point of like why you can't even know God unless God is already at work in you, because only God knows God. Like, which scripture specifically says that the Spirit is the one who plumbs the depths of God, and only he knows him. And so it's like, you can't know God unless the Spirit who plumbs the depths of God is already operating in your depths and plumbing you. And but that's actually the optimistic point, where it is possible that some understanding can begin to form.
That's beautiful. I mean, basically, as I understand Hegel, the idea is that the absolute, everything is in the absolute situation, or the absolute idealism that he talks about, which everything has already been working through you as part of the absolute. So you can't, so this is a funny thing. You can't get to the thing in of itself, but the thing in of itself has already put itself in you. And so it's done a very similar move in the absolute. Like, everything is part of the absolute. The absolute is not some enlightened point where you know everything. The absolute is the working through of everything with every thing. That is, everything is giving itself to one another, but you can't get anything. You can only receive things that you've already received, and that's why you can know them. So the funny thing is that coherence corresponds not because you achieve correspondence, but because the correspondence is always already in the coherence, but you have to trust it. The inability to have certainty in the correspondence then is precisely the evidence that you are in relation with it. Because certainty, once you have certainty, you don't need relation. Oh, I know that. Like, once you're certain you know what your wife's going to do or whatever, oh, you don't need to relate to them. You know what they're going to do, right? So then what ends up happening is the epistemological goal of certainty destroys relation. I don't need to know the bookcase. I don't need to understand the relation. I know everything there is. So Hegel is like, what Hegel's trying to do is, how do you get a kind of confidence where you're not in nihilism, I can't know anything, but then also not shut down the relation? Well, this is where you kind of posit the absolute, where you say, well, things have actually, you already have things in the absolute, that when you seek coherence, you're part of the world that the thing is situated in. So you can get actual knowledge, but you can't get certainty. And that then creates the incentive to maintain a relation in the same way, like you're saying with Bart, like God has worked in you, and you can't get to God, but God in working to you has made possible real knowledge, even if that's not the entirety of the knowledge, because if so, that would be idolatry. So I think there's a similar model at work in Hegel as well.
It's interesting what you're saying, that like knowledge as certainty is a defense against relation. And it makes me think about the obsessive subjective structure in psychoanalysis, where the obsessive makes the other person an object in order to create a separation from the other. And you can just treat them like an object and extract enjoyment from them. But you don't have to engage into that intimate relationship of they could hurt you and you potentially have to give to them. But if you could just through certainty make them an object, fully manipulable, then you can just extract enjoyment. And so I think that like the rationalist is fundamentally the obsessive, whereas this is why I think that Zizek emphasizes the hysterical subjective position so much, is because the hysterical subjective position is that position of the absolute doubting itself. Because the absolute has that doubt, is constitutively split, and so the subject who is a part of that absolute expresses and experiences the absolute's doubting itself. And this is Kyoto school Nishitani Buddhism as well.
Outstanding. Before I forget, and first off, you probably heard a tractor go by a few times. So, you know, the sounds of tractors and babies are good for the program. You know, before I forget, earlier, you know, we were talking about rationality, autonomous rationality, eating itself, et cetera, so forth. And like you were describing, like rationality has this tendency to cut off relation and enjoy that lack of relation, because the relation is always the other that could be a threat, right? Because who knows what they're going to do. There's a kind of enjoyment of being in the presence of the other without relating to the other, right? You know, that's what we like to do, these kind of psychoanalytical gymnastics that we like to do. Well, Benjamin Fonday and like Levi Strauss warned that rationality that never has to acknowledge the impossible or the irrational or the absurd will ultimately lead into Nazi Germany. And Benjamin Fonday ends up being killed by the Nazis because they're like, if there's no room in your thinking for the impossible, this thing that can break through, then you're going to end up in all the game theory dynamics they talk about with the meta crisis. Like all this stuff about the meta crisis and we're all going to die, basically, rather it be from global warming, population, it doesn't matter. Like Daniel Schleiermacher, all those people, all of that is indeed those Nash equilibrium game theory things is what happens when you have a rationality that isn't relatable, that doesn't have to relate with the world, basically. It has no relation with the non-rational. So that's an overriding point here. So the question is, the moment you have a framing of correspondence versus coherence, there's right there a danger of falling into all that. And yet there also seems to be some level of importance with correspondence, because otherwise you could just have magical thinking where everyone is like, well, I just believe what I want to believe, and it doesn't have to correspond with anything. And so you end up in, you know, QAnon conspiracies. And I think a lot of those have the structures of dream states. Like it's hard to see January, the insurrection, and not see people dressed as buffalo. It looks like a giant kind of dreamscape, right? And different things. So you have this real question of how you can have, if you grant me the language, real knowledge, and yet not believe in objects that kill relation, right? So how do you have things be alive and changing and things you can never entirely capture, and yet at the same time that not mean you're stuck in your own kind of epistemological bubble, you know, stuck on a noumenon or something like that? Well, in theology, like you're describing with Bart, it's the idea of, well, God gave himself to you. Right. And so even if you can't directly get at God, you can have a real relation with God. And therefore, the effort of theology to know God is not meaningless. There is a reason to do it that actually changes, and this is the Hegelian kind of thing, that changes the subject, that changes how they are in the world, which makes them more capable to participate in the world in a glorious way, as opposed to maybe getting sucked into a political campaign and rationalization like in the novel Silence that you were talking about, right? So likewise, what kind of Hegel can put forth is the notion of, well, actually, thought always worlds. You're always worlding. So you can't get to things in of themselves, but you have no reason to think you can't get into worlds in themselves. And that's the revelation of a dream of which unveils what thought does when left to its own devices. A dream is never of a thing. It's always of a world. You mentioned that. A dream always gives you a world. Don't you know the world? You know, there's a way in which you know the world, even if you can't know. Well, let me put it this way. A dream shows you that thought always worlds. So likewise, when you're in real world, like thought worlds, you have a world. But if you go, can I get to the bookcase itself? You're doing something with thought that thought doesn't present to it. Like that's not what thought does. Thought doesn't present things. It presents worlds. And if you go, well, wait, the world I am part of, and therefore is already in me. So if I think about the world, I might get real knowledge. But if I think about the bookcase, I probably won't. So in the same way that God gave himself to you so you can think meaningfully about God in terms of his revelation and in concert with reason and all of that, likewise, the world has given itself to you in making you part of it so you can get real knowledge about the world, but you can't get real knowledge about things. Because the moment you do that, you're treating something in the world like it is not. So that's kind of like the move. And then the question is, what is real knowledge about the world, right? Well, instead of talking about what is the bookcase to itself, you start talking about what is the bookcase to me. And that relation is actually quite real. And then who am I in the world? So what would it mean in a kind of, what would it mean to try to get to the world in itself as opposed to things in itself and how the world kind of presents itself?
I love that. I'm gonna be thinking about that for a while. It makes what this leads me to is this curiosity about wondering with Nietzsche about where does this tendency to envision a thing in itself come from? Because it feels like it feels like it's deeper, and we're like trying to beat it out of ourselves. Like, where did this misconception come from, and why does it feel like I want it and I cannot break out of that particular way of thinking that there's a more real thing, or that there's something behind the thing that I'm experiencing that is somehow more real, the actual thing, and that is different potentially. Like, where does that feeling come from? And how did it get into our brains? And like, because it's just so unhelpful. Like, but maybe it's helpful for something. Maybe that's where it came from. I don't know. But like, it seems profoundly unhelpful and just misleading us constantly.
That is a absolutely $1 million question. So I guess this is what, like, it's really interesting. I'll have to, like what you were saying about symbols mean humans think. That's a really interesting framing. And it's almost like, I guess for me, the act of thought always reduces. Like, you can't think the world, but this is why actually saying you can only like get knowledge of the world is great, because there's an inherent humility in that. Because it's like the only real knowledge you can get of the world. Oh, and by the way, you have to use a thinking that is always going to be just a part of the world. So whatever you think, you have to immediately deconstruct back into relation. So there's a kind of hold, let go that happens if real world knowledge can only be located in the world. Then if you think about a thing, it's always framed. You were saying that as well, and that's very true. So you have to always frame and release. And like that's like idolatry is where you hold a thing too long or too tightly as opposed to release it. Like God gives you like corn, for example, to eat, but then you're like, well, I'm going to believe in like God, the corn is a God, right? That I'm going to worship or something. Well, now it's an idolatry. You have to release it back in to the creative order. So I guess the first thing that comes to mind is the very experience of thought is a feeling of taking everything and focusing on the bookcase to think about it, which then, here's the trick. Maybe this is it. I'll be curious what you think of this. What I'm losing is what's around the bookcase, not what's behind the bookcase per se. But the moment, but the moment I focus on the bookcase, I'm only focusing on the bookcase. So when I experience that loss of something, I only have the bookcase to focus on to say, oh, it's the thing in of itself I can't get, as opposed to the world around the bookcase that I lost in the act of focusing on the bookcase. So it's like what you lose is the world in of itself per se to think about the bookcase. And since you're only thinking about the bookcase in your frame, the loss that you feel is then turned around and put in the bookcase as opposed to around the bookcase where what it was originally. So there's a kind of trick that happens. And then maybe there's something about us that likes this in a kind of Lacanian sense, because it feels much more reachable to say I can get to the bookcase in of itself than the world in of itself, right? It's like, and also the world could kill me, but the bookcase is over there. I'm kind of God over that. So I have to do something with the feeling of loss. I know I've lost something in the reduction, but I don't want to locate it in the world because that's kind of bigger than me and maybe has a power over me. And it also feels rational in that focus to then make the thing behind the bookcase or in the bookcase per se, which then gives me a power over it, makes it not a threat. And it feels like I can actually achieve that goal because it's there. And if I say, well, I can't get to the thing of itself, I at least have decided I can't get to the thing of itself, maybe. Whereas if it's like the world, oh, you could get to the world. You just need to go outside your comfort zone and experience the other, right? So if I make the thing I can't obtain something that's unobtainable, as opposed to something that I'll never fully obtain, but I could relate to if I would just open myself up to the other, that also gets me out of all the discomfort of encountering other people. So there seems to be a number of, so there is the phenomenological mistake of in the act of focusing, saying the loss is behind the thing I'm focusing on. And there's maybe a psychoanalytical reason as well, which is I can avoid the world and all the otherness of it. And then maybe also from a theological standpoint, I can avoid God because I can kind of turn the thing in of itself to a God I don't know. So then that kind of nagging feeling that, of God calling you, I can say, oh, that's not God. It's the thing in of itself of the bookcase. So maybe there's like the theological sort of take on it as well, where it feels like you're being a good theological steward because you're seeking some sort of transcendent, which is the thing of itself. But the thing of itself can't, call on you to, go fish of men or anything, right? It's all in your service. So it's like there's a phenomenological, psychoanalytical, and maybe a theological angles I'm thinking of.
I really like the framing of like when you lose the world, when you reduce to the object, you lose the world, and the loss of the world kind of gets read into the object as
Yes.
the thing that you're missing. I like that framing. I'm going to be thinking about it. I wonder if I suspect, like, if that's the case, I suspect there's not really a way around that because that is just what thought does.
Yes.
So I wonder if the answer is to change ourselves such that we do not feel the allure of that wound, of whatever that unchanging lack that we've posited in the object is. Like, I think that my reading of Nietzsche is that the reason we think that world is more real is because we hate the world. Like,
yes.
if you hate your world, anything that appears unchanging, separate, apart from it is going to draw you. And so what you have to become is you have to become a vital creature that loves the world, because then when you're presented with the world in all of its complexity and potential pain and intimacy of relation and the dead sterile world, you go, why would I want that? Like, just instinctually. It's fundamentally about the valuation. I don't think you're going to ever get away from the messy object and the pure lack that appears as its double, because that's what thought produces. But you can change yourself to be a different type of person such that you love a different side of that equation.
You put it all so beautifully. For me, this is what thought does. Like, the structure of thought itself creates this problem. And then in creating that problem, it creates the desire to reify, to cement that problem in its state, because it gives you all sorts of power. It helps you avoid the other. So there's it's a phenomenological, epistemological mistake that is part of thought, and it's not actually a mistake to thought itself. It's what thought does. So you have to think about what thought does to realize that's not what you want to do. But then again, maybe it is, because the world sucks and you don't like the world. So maybe you want it to do that, right? No, this to me, like, if we want thought that isn't going to be toxic, like we were talking at the beginning between kind of this toxic knowledge and this understanding and truth, like now we're kind of bordering on the truth, which the truth, in Hegel, the truth is the whole, which of course you can never wholly know, right? So it's like, this is where you're looking at this dynamic interplay between the subject, thought, the structure of thought itself, which we need to have under, to operate, because if we don't have coherence, we're going to be in trouble. So you need thought to operate, but that very thing you need to operate naturally presents objects as things in of themselves, which is a trap, but it's natural to fall into that because that's what thought presented you. And if thought saved your life from the lion and the coyote and things, why would you start questioning thought now? So you have to know when to question thought and when not to question thought, which sucks, because then you have to have the skill to do that. And the only reason you're even going to take the time to develop that skill is because life is worth living. If life isn't worth living, or you're unhappy, or it's dirty, why would you bother to go all that different work? So you see where you cannot separate. And basically, one of the reasons philosophy has been so destructive, the majority of it has been bad philosophy following David Hume, which is philosophy that eats its own tail. It's a snake eating its own tail. It's auto-cannibalistic, meaning you eat yourself. It's because thought doesn't see that what is naturally correct to thought are precisely mechanisms of concealing you from a world that you may want if you hate the world. So then you have to back up and say, what kind of subject am I thinking? And then Hegel would say, great, now you're going to change who you are as a subject, which means you're going to change the world in a more vitalistic way, which will then work back on you. And now the absolute is developing based on this way of working through. It's not like a mystical magic trick. It's going, oh, thought in of itself is never absolute, because it is always situated in a subject of which decides when thought is wise. or when thought is well. And it's exactly what you said. You put it so well. It's like if you don't love life, thinking will take a character of someone who's trying to escape life. If you love life, it will take the character or quality in the situation of someone who loves life. I think you put it very well.
Well, I think that what you said also makes me think that thought doesn't really have the resources to be its own policeman.
No.
And this,
no.
what this makes me think is that you need practices
Yes.
to be able to do this, because it's not going to be thought that's going to do this. What you have to do is develop practices that are able to produce symbols, maybe, because I think because symbols are in the meaning realm. You need to produce meanings that are able to be too dense and thorny for thought to be able to fully neutralize. And so it's constantly getting regulated so that it doesn't run out of control. But it's practices that are going to produce these dense, thorny meanings, these symbols that are constantly breaking up the stale, dead structure of thought.
No, I think thinking cannot be its own policeman. But the weird thing that's very difficult to describe is once you know thinking cannot be its own policeman, and you do in fact engage in the practices that you need to be the kind of subject who can think life, not death, are you still thinking? What is the word now that refers to what you're doing? This is where this is the Hegel negation sublation. You are still thinking, but it's not thinking. The is not yet, right? It's like already not yet kind of thing in Christianity. Like there's this kind of like, you're always in a sense still fallen, I guess you could almost say, but it's not the same kind of fallenness. There's still a kind of trace it, but actually the trace it of the problematic thing is now sublimated into something kind of holier, right? It's like New Jerusalem kind of contains Eden, but now it has a certain higher quality, you could argue, because you've gone through history and the blood of Christ and everything to make it possible. So there's this weird thing in which you're still thinking, but it's not thinking. And this is what's hard. It's after you do the skills, or it's like it's thinking that is aware of that thinking is its own problem. Is that still thinking, or is it something else? Do we want to call it wisdom?
That's the question.
Yeah.
Like what is this mode beyond thinking, where thinking has regulated and purified itself? I think Buddhism would call it enlightenment or awakening,
Sure.
I think that Christianity would call it life in the spirit, or resurrection life. I don't think those are exactly equivalent, but I think that what everybody's trying to get at is that there is some sort of, I think most people have the sense that if you're able to achieve that, it is qualitatively different. Like it is a different sort of experience than what you have when you are thinking in kind of this on the plane of subject object.
Yeah, and so the weird thing, because to me, again, the Hegelian framework is so interesting here. So he's going to call this basically speculative knowing, which is beyond dialectical thinking. The dialect is not the end for Hegel. That's only the realizing there's a passing over that then you come to realize to then negate sublate into speculative knowing. So there's like another step to it, if you will, that the whole point of the dialectic is for. So there's this weird thing. If we go back to humans think, symbols mean, which I really like because I think there's a lot there. There's a notion where you start with the humans think, then you pass over into, wait, symbols mean. There seems to be a difference between what symbols do and what humans do. So there's a difference, but then you go, but wait a minute, meaning requires thinking to mean, but then also a symbol that means might only point to things in of themselves versus how does a symbol mean in a way that it discloses the world, right? Like there's a difference between like the bookcase meaning bookcase and then bookcase meaning a bookcase situated in a world where the bookcase is the world, right? So you get a different understanding of the meaning. Well, you have to go through thinking to change the kind of natural meaning that might be organized toward things in of itself to then open it to making sure the meaning is always disclosing a world in the same way that thinking is always making sure it doesn't mean something that suggests thinking isn't problematic. So then there's this kind of passing over realizing there's a bothness going on. But if there's a bothness going on, that means there's a relation going on. Now you're in the relation, and there's a transformation of the quality of which both are doing, not in a unity, but a changing in the quality of then how symbols mean. Now symbols mean there's a world, not that there's a thing in of itself. Now humans are thinking not to correspond, but because they are creatively active in a situation. And then you're moving between those two. Now you're moving between those two. And then Hegel's like, maybe there's another speculative level and another speculative level. Now this can start to sound kind of mystical and evolutionary and kind of worrisome, but there is a weird thing where it does seem, I guess this is like the crazy level. There isn't, even this kind of knowledge might become toxic, right? Because you can start going, oh, we have a higher quality of thought. And now speculative knowing can fall back into a certain toxicity that then you have to move out of. And then there's a new meta level and a new meta. There's this constant active moving of the absolute spirit. Like, so for example, let's say you read Lacan and you know the dangers of Lacan. Is it possible that knowing about Lacan could actually make you more susceptible to falling in to some of the problematic dynamics of Lacan, because you say, oh, I've read Lacan, therefore I'm not at risk? You see, there's right there knowledge that's actually good then falls back into being knowledge that's problematic. Likewise, knowing there's a world could actually maybe somehow fall back into being problematic. So there's also, well, right there, that means the subject has to always be actively reconsidering itself, kind of situating itself, rediscerning itself, this perpetual activity to thought, that if it's lost, then you're always at risk of falling back.
I'm intrigued by what you're talking about in meaning there. And one of the strengths that symbols bring, I think, is that they are able to both pick something out, because they do have this, like a sign corresponds to something, but it never just corresponds to one thing. A sign has this ability to pick something out, but it's able to maintain the relations at the same time, because you can pick that thing out, but the sign, because it's not necessarily like through necessity connected to that thing, it still maintains multiple ways that you could read the thing. And by putting that sign into relationship with other signs, you actually proliferate potential relations and meanings. So it's like if you were thinking, you cut something out of the world, you have one thing, but a sign gives you the ability to pull something out of the whole while still maintaining all of those tangled web connections that you can then kind of start to explore and follow.
No, so this is extremely interesting because it seems to me that thinking is different from signs. So signs can lead thinking in a way, right? So it's like, it's leading thinking, which thinking can be led because it can think, right? It can say, oh, this sign means something, and I can understand that meaning, and therefore I can follow it. But there seems to be a difference between a sign that stops the progress, like it's like, oh, this means eat. That's it. You don't ever stop, well, wait a minute, it means eat. Isn't that kind of mystifying that I can hear a sound and automatically think eat? What if I were to actually think run or something? And I think this is what kind of Derrida wants to suggest, right? That a sign could actually open up, but very often a human being just takes it in a linear direction, which is then, so then this is it. So there's a kind of way where thinking treats the sign in a manner that doesn't open up the world, which then means the thinking reduces a sign to being a thing that simply points to one thing. So it's almost like thinking always has a temptation to treating a sign in a reductionist manner. Like maybe...
I agree with that, but let's also give reason its due here. This is where reason's virtues emerge, actually, and why it needs to exist, because the signs left to themselves will never close.
Right.
So the sign is this infinite play that's always slipping. And this is Lacan's point about the system. There has to be something where you have to just pause it away for it to all hang together. Yeah. And that's what reason can do. Reason keeps you from just infinite play, yes, and just tuning into this hallucinatory, constant dreaming state where there is none of the correspondence that you're talking about. So like left to their own devices, both signs or reason can both lead you to madness.
Yes.
It's only through their own mutual regulation and working together that you end up with something like a process of working through?
I think that what you just said is really, really, really big. And I know we're coming up on the last 12 minutes, but I've really enjoyed this. So a few things. I think this is really important. So we've talked about how thinking, left to its own devices, can seek an auto-cannibalistic coherence where it can kind of eat itself. And also those symbols, precisely in their infinity, can eat itself. So you know, a lot of time, like in the trilogy, we'll talk about the true isn't the rational. So the rational is thinking that we can associate, which is auto-cannibalistic, and autonomous rationality eats itself, but also autonomous non-rationality eats itself, ergo something that doesn't have to be translated into thinking. So there's this double play here that has to be kept in mind. And I think here then we start to suggest why, if we want to think theological, you have the hiddenness of God, which basically also is the hiddenness of the absolute as well. So we have to be given something as human beings that has the ability to constrain the sign, right? But in having the ability to constrain the sign, we also are at risk of losing the sign, because you might constrain it in the wrong way, or you might just ignore the sign and just work with the thing over here that is thinking to itself. So then what's so interesting when we go back to Dante, I guess Augustine with imagination and will, there's this notion that in Dante, love of a woman like Beatrice is in fact the necessary sign pointing to God's love that gradually leads you to God, because if you can't go all at once to God, because you can't understand what you're seeing, you don't have the faculties and it kind of overwhelms you, right? So the infinite has to be disclosed to the finite by something infinitude. Because otherwise there is no fight. Well, one, there's no difference. There's just God if there's no finitude, right? So if there's relation, there's difference. But the moment there's difference, there's a problem. Because how do you get the finite to the infinite if you can't just start it in the infinite? By definition, it would have to learn how to become more infinite according to finite means, right? So then you have the Beatrice, who's the sign pointing to God's love, but you can't smile at the beginning or Dante will be reduced to ask. He has this point where Dante's like, Beatrice, why don't you smile? And she's like, well, at this point in the Paradiso, if I did, it would reduce you to ash. She doesn't smile till the top because it's too much glory. So it's like the sun behind a cloud has to be disclosed gradually so you're not blinded. Likewise, Beatrice has to gradually be a sign pointing more and more to the infinite so it doesn't overwhelm Dante, and he's gradually sort of pulled along, right? So this is where the hiddenness of God is actually necessary for the relation with God, where God has to gradually be unhidden, because if he's all at once, thinking can't handle it. But then if he's totally hidden in a kind of Pascal way, you're never going to find God. But because of this necessity of the dynamic of a sign that has a risk and thinking that has a risk, you have to have these risks. This dynamic brings with it the necessity of a structure that the sign gradually unveils itself as reason is able to capture, go along. So likewise, the hiddenness of God through Beatrice might be the hiddenness of the absolute through things, right? There has to be the possibility of thinking, believing there are things in of itself, because there has to be a hiddenness, precisely so thinking can be gradually unveiled to more and more of the world in of itself, that if thinking was given all at once, it would be overwhelmed and it couldn't make sense of any of it. So it has to be gradual, but precisely because it has to be gradual, there's possibility of error along the way. So there might be like a theological parallel with epistemology here.
Yeah, I think that if we read this eschatologically through the story of Scripture, what we find is that God is preparing creation to meet him. And so I think that there's this sense in which God first enters in. He becomes a part of our world, becomes a participant with us, becomes our co-laborer. And through his life, through his working with and us participating with him in this world that we're making together, there's a sense in which he is preparing it to be a suitable partner for himself. And that there's actually this like beautiful, and this is why Scripture ends with a marriage, like a comedy. It ends with the bride meeting her husband, and the Westminster Confession of Faith begins, the first question, what is the chief end of man? It says to glorify God and enjoy him forever, which is this very sexual Lacanian answer, actually. And like, what's more sexual than a bride and her husband getting married? And so there's this way in which God is preparing the cosmos for this sexual enjoyment
Yes.
of the lover and his beloved.
Yes. Oh, I think that's beautifully put. I mean, there's a long tradition of like beatific visions, mysticism, having ecstasy, sexual intercourse. These things, like if intercourse is to become one, you know, you have different gender, like a same function, so there's a kind of unity there. 2, 1 is like the Trinity, right? Like there's difference, but one essence, right, in a kind of function. So likewise, the highest form of loving God, the beatific vision, has an eros to it. And if we think about what we see in epistemology is a kind of erotic movement of thought, well, then we can see how like this cold, stuffy epistemology actually has a lot to do with Lacan and psychoanalysis. Because the very way that you think about the bookcase is an effort to meet the bookcase. Like you want to know the bookcase, right? As like to kind of like meet with it. But in that act of wanting to know the bookcase, what do people do in marriages? They reduce their spouse to their ideas. They reduce them to who they think they ought to be, in the same way that we reduce it to a thing versus a network of relations in a world. We don't treat, it's very natural for us to treat our spouse not as a world, like where they come from a world, but as a thing that fits in our world, right? So we do the same thing with the bookcase. We treat it as a thing in our world, really, when really it's disclosing a world that we're a part of just as much as it is. Likewise, the spouse is supposed to be a revelation that we're a part of creation that is greater than us just as much as they are. So so in the spousal relationship, you see a parallel with the revelation of how we're supposed to treat the entire world. And then, of course, that would be in the image and likeness of how God is with creation, and God is with himself as a Trinity. So you see eros running down the whole thing, and then hiddenness. Well, eros and hiddenness go together. It's alluring, desire. You know, the veil has an important function, like the possibility of something more. And even when you know someone fully, in the act of knowing them fully, this is a Hegel move, there is creation and change occurring. So the point of full knowing then creates more to know. A mystery always elongates in its knowing. And so it's not that you don't get real knowledge, it's that the act of getting the real knowledge creates new conditions of the situation for there to be more real knowledge. And so there's never boredom. And this is all eros. Eros runs down the whole thing, and then we can see why Lacan is so useful, why we have to think psychoanalytic into traditional thought, why phenomenology, all these things go together, because basically philosophy without eros is dead. And we're seeing that eros has to run through as the love that moves the sun and other stars, as Dante would put it.
Well, I think it's fitting that we end on love.
I think so as well, Matthew, because I've loved every minute of it. So, Mr. Stanley, I appreciate this very much. Thank you for your time today. I'm glad that we could talk about intercourse with the universe. That's always good. That's good stuff. And Mr. Stanley, if people wanted to find more of their work, which they most certainly should, where should they go? What should they do? Should they shoot off flare guns, carrier pigeons? Should they look under their desk? What's a good place to find more of your wonder?
If you were interested in hearing more words from my mouth, which you've already heard perhaps too many, you could go to samsara.clinic. That's my domain where my newsletter is. I post every Friday morning, and I'm also working on a book. You can find out more at readingsilence.com. You can also pre-order the book there. I also have a YouTube channel. I don't post there very much. I'm trying to post there more, but it tends to fall to the back of the priority list. So yeah, I've loved this time thoroughly. I'll stop the recording and I'll get you the transcript so people could enjoy in a different form.
Oh, yeah, Mr. Stanley has brought forth the wonders of new AI technology on transcripting the conversation, which is straight wonder. So well done to you, sir. Well, Mr. Stanley, I salute you for all the undertakings that you are following on all of these different platforms. And I appreciate your work, and I appreciate your family and everyone that is part of this and making this possible. God bless you and yours. And thank you so much, Mr. Stanley, for your time.